RoboCop. 1987 is the story of a police officer who is killed, then returns as an unstoppable machine to enforce justice. But behind what seems like a film of guns and robots are real lives far more brutal than anything on screen. There was one man, the film's most terrifying villain, who grew up after his father murdered his mother, then took his own life. And that was only the beginning. Once you learn what truly happened to this cast, RoboCop will never feel the same again. Kurtwood Smith as Clarence Boddicker. On screen, he was chaos with a grin. Clarence Boddicker, a man who laughed while pulling the trigger, but behind that performance was a truth far more unsettling one that began long before Hollywood ever called his name. Kurtwood Larson Smith, born July 3, 1943 in New Lisbon, Wisconsin, stepped into RoboCop at 44 and delivered a villain so magnetic it became one of the defining antagonists of the 1980s. Audiences remembered the brutality, the dark humor, the unpredictable menace. They remembered how he killed Murphy and set the entire story in motion. But what they didn't see was how naturally that darkness seemed to live behind his eyes. Before the cameras, Smith's life followed a quieter path. Education, discipline, a steady climb through theater, earning his MFA at Stanford after studying at San Jose State. Yet beneath that structure was a childhood marked by a devastating rupture. His father killed his mother, then took his own life. It is a detail rarely spoken aloud, but impossible to ignore once known. How does a man carry something like that and still learn to make audiences laugh even as they fear him? After RoboCop, Smith refused to be trapped by villainy. He moved through films like Dead Poets Society and Rambo 3, but it was television that reshaped him. As Red Foreman in that 70s show, he became something entirely different. A hard-edged but deeply human father figure delivering humor with the same precision he once used for menace. Off-screen, his life found steadiness through family. After an early divorce in 1974, he remarried Joan Perkle in 1988, building a lasting partnership and raising children and grandchildren far from the chaos that defined his youth. Now in his 80s, still active through that 90s show, Smith stands as a quiet contradiction, proof that even the darkest beginnings can lead to a life not defined by them, but shaped beyond them. And he's not the only one with stories behind RoboCop. Peter Weller as Alex Murphy/RoboCop. He became immortal in Steel, yet quietly walked away from the very fame that made him unforgettable. Peter Francis Weller, born June 24, 1947 in Stevens Point, Wisconsin, was 40 when he stepped into the RoboCop suit and redefined what it meant to be human on screen. As Alex Murphy, he was more than a cyborg. He was grief memory and identity struggling to survive beneath cold armor. Audiences didn't just watch him, they felt him. The slow movements, the restrained voice, the haunting stillness, it all carried a weight that lingered long after the film ended. But before the armor, Weller's life was shaped by movement and discipline. The son of a federal judge and helicopter pilot, he grew up between countries and cultures, while his mother, a jazz pianist, introduced him to Miles Davis at just 9 years old. Acting came through study, not chance, rooted in theater, and sharpened through years of persistence. And then came RoboCop along with a little-known truth. The suit weighed over 60 pounds, forcing Weller to relearn how to move each gesture choreographed like a mechanical ballet. It wasn't just acting, it was endurance. So what happens when a man reaches the peak and chooses to leave it? After RoboCop 2, Weller stepped away from the trajectory of a typical action star. He pursued a master's at Syracuse, then a PhD in Italian Renaissance art at UCLA, trading red carpets for lecture halls. While others chased visibility, he chose depth. His personal life followed a quieter rhythm. In 2006, he married Shari Stowe on his own birthday and built a family life centered around their daughter. Now in his late 70s, still directing, teaching, and appearing selectively, Weller remains a rare figure in Hollywood, A man who proved that identity is not what the world projects onto you, but what you choose to become after the spotlight fades. Ronny Cox as Dick Jones. He played a man who would sacrifice anything for power, yet in real life, the one thing he could never replace was the love he lost. Daniel Ronald Cox, born July 23, 1938 in Cloudcroft, New Mexico, was 49 when he stepped into the role of Dick Jones in RoboCop, delivering a performance so chilling it became the perfect face of corporate corruption in 1980s cinema. As the calculating executive behind OCP's darkest decisions, Cox created a villain who didn't need rage to be terrifying, only quiet control, sharp words, and the certainty that he would never be held accountable. But long before Hollywood, his life was rooted in something far simpler. Raised in a working-class family in Portales, New Mexico, he spent his early years on a dairy farm, learning discipline through routine and hardship. It was also there in high school that he met Mary, the woman who would quietly shape the rest of his life. Acting came later, built steadily through persistence rather than sudden fame, with early roles in films like Deliverance revealing a presence that directors couldn't ignore. And yet, what many never realized was that Ronny Cox was just as devoted to music as he was to acting. Even at the height of his film career, he would perform live sometimes over 100 shows a year, choosing connection over celebrity. But then came the loss that changed everything. In 2006, on the very anniversary of the day they first met, Mary passed away after 46 years of marriage. How does a man who spent a lifetime building something so enduring learn to live without it? Now, in his late 80s, Cox has stepped away from the intensity of film, returning instead to music. A quieter stage, but perhaps a more honest one. And in the end, behind every powerful villain he played there, remains a man who understood that love once lost is the only role that can never be rewritten. Nancy Allen as Officer Ann Lewis. She stood beside a machine and reminded audiences what it meant to still be human, but behind that strength was a life shaped by loss, endings, and a quiet decision to walk away from it all. Nancy Ann Allen, born June 24, 1950 in the Bronx, New York, was 37 when she became Officer Ann Lewis in RoboCop, the steady, fearless partner who refused to see Murphy as just a machine. She wasn't just a supporting character. She was the emotional anchor, the one presence that held on to compassion in a world being stripped of it. Before Hollywood, her life was disciplined and artistic. The daughter of a police lieutenant, Allen grew up understanding authority and order, while her training at New York's High School of Performing Arts immersed her in dance and performance. Acting followed naturally, leading to early roles in Carrie and Dressed to Kill, where she worked closely with director Brian De Palma, who would later become her husband. But even then, success came with instability. After RoboCop, Allen remained closely tied to the franchise, appearing in its sequels, yet her career gradually slowed. Her personal life told a more turbulent story. 3 marriages, including her union with De Palma from 1979 to 1984, all ended in divorce, each chapter closing quietly but leaving its mark. And then came the loss that changed her path entirely. When her close friend Wendy Jo Sperber died of cancer, Allen stepped away from acting, choosing purpose over visibility. Why continue chasing roles, she seemed to ask, when real lives needed saving? By 2026, in her mid-70s, she lives far from the spotlight, dedicating herself as executive director of the We Spark Cancer Support Center, helping others navigate the very pain that once touched her life so closely. In the end, while the world remembers her as the heart of RoboCop, her truest role may be the one she chose after the cameras stopped, quiet, compassionate, and profoundly real. Miguel Ferrer as Bob Morton. He helped create a machine that defied death. Yet his own life would be cut short in a way no one could rewrite. Miguel Jose Ferrer, born February 7, 1955 in Santa Monica, California, stepped into RoboCop at just 32, portraying Bob Morton, the ambitious executive who saw opportunity where others saw tragedy. On screen, he was sharp, arrogant, and effortlessly cool. The man who turned a fallen officer into a corporate weapon. Audiences didn't just watch him, they recognized him, the rising figure who believed control could outpace consequence. Off-screen, Ferrer was born into legacy. The son of Academy Award-winning actor Jose Ferrer and singer Rosemary Clooney and cousin to George Clooney, he grew up surrounded by fame, yet began not as an actor, but as a drummer chasing rhythm before finding his voice in performance. That shift would define him. From Twin Peaks to Crossing Jordan and NCIS Los Angeles, he built a career on intelligence and presence rather than spectacle. His personal life moved through 2 marriages, raising children while maintaining a reputation for quiet professionalism. But what happens when a voice so distinctive begins to fade? In 2017, Ferrer died at 61 after battling throat cancer, continuing to work almost until the end. By 2026, his performances remain precise, controlled, unforgettable. And perhaps that is the final irony. The man who gave life to RoboCop's future left behind a legacy that still refuses to disappear. And as the story progresses, it becomes even more unbelievable. But before we continue, which character haunted you the most? Don't forget to like and subscribe to Legends of Classic so you don't miss out on more behind-the-scenes stories like this one. Dan O'Herlihy as the old man. He played a man who controlled empires with a calm smile. Yet in real life, his greatest legacy was not power, but the life he built quietly beyond the screen. Daniel Peter O'Herlihy, born May 1st, 1919 in Wexford, Ireland, was 68 when he appeared in RoboCop as the Old Man, the unseen force behind OCPA leader whose authority felt effortless, almost understated. He wasn't loud nor openly cruel, but his decisions shaped everything, embodying a kind of power that never needed to raise its voice. Before acting, O'Herlihy's path seemed destined for something entirely different. He studied architecture at the National University of Ireland, a discipline rooted in structure and design skills that would later echo in the precision of his performances. But the stage called to him, and by the 1950s, he had already earned an Academy Award nomination for Adventures of Robinson Crusoe, establishing himself as an actor of quiet intensity. A lesser-known truth is that he often approached roles like an architect, carefully constructing characters layer by layer, never rushing the process. Off-screen, his life followed a rare and steady course. He married Elsie Bennett, and their partnership lasted nearly 6 decades, raising 5 children, many of whom would follow him into the world of film. But even a life built with such care cannot escape time. In 2005, at the age of 85, O'Herlihy passed away from natural causes, closing a chapter defined not by scandal, but by consistency. By 2026, his presence remains a subtle echo proof that sometimes the most powerful lives are the ones lived with quiet purpose, far from the noise they once commanded. Ray Wise as Leon Nash. He once played a man capable of unthinkable cruelty. Yet his real life would become a story of stability few in Hollywood ever achieve. Raymond Herbert Wise, born August 20th, 1947 in Akron, Ohio, was 40 when he appeared in RoboCop as Leon Nash, one of Clarence Boddicker's most ruthless enforcers. On screen, he was part of the chaos that shattered Alex Murphy's life, a figure audiences feared without hesitation. There was no softness, no hesitation, only violence delivered with chilling certainty. But beyond that brutality was a very different man. Raised in a family with Romanian roots through his mother, Wise pursued education at Kent State University, where his path toward acting slowly took shape. His early career was not defined by instant success, but by persistence, small roles, steady work, and a determination to remain present in an industry that often forgets those who don't break through immediately. Then came a turning point few could have predicted. In Twin Peaks, Wise transformed, completely portraying Leland Palmer with a haunting emotional depth that revealed a range far beyond anything seen in RoboCop. It was a performance that stunned audiences and redefined his career. Off-screen, his life moved in the opposite direction of his characters. Married to Cass McClaskey since 1978, he built a lasting partnership and raised 2 children, both drawn into acting. But how does someone so often cast in darkness remain untouched by it? By 2026, at 78, Wise continues to act his career marked not by chaos, but by quiet endurance. Proof that sometimes the most enduring legacy is simply staying true to yourself while everything else changes. Paul McCrane as Emil Antonowski. He became unforgettable for a death that audiences could never unsee, yet spent the rest of his life proving he was far more than that moment. Paul David McCrane, born January 19, 1961 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, was only 26 when he appeared in RoboCop as Emil Antonowski, a reckless gang member whose fate dissolving in toxic waste became one of the most disturbing scenes in 1980s cinema. It was grotesque, shocking, almost surreal, and for many it was all they remembered. But McCrane's path began long before that image. Educated at Holy Ghost Preparatory School, he moved to New York to study acting drawn not by spectacle, but by craft. His early career showed promise through Fame, where he revealed a different side, sensitive, musical human. The contrast was striking. How does someone go from vulnerability to becoming the face of cinematic horror? Behind the scenes, the infamous melting sequence required hours of prosthetics layered latex and precise physical control, less chaos than choreography, a performance hidden beneath effects. After RoboCop, McCrane steadily rebuilt his identity, refusing to be trapped by a single image. His role as Dr. Romano in ER showcased intensity of a different kind. Sharp, complex, unforgettable, while his work expanded into directing television and even music. By 2026, at 65, he continues to create quietly shaping stories behind the camera. And perhaps that is his real legacy, not the moment he dissolved, but the years he spent proving he never truly disappeared. Robert DoQui as Sergeant Warren Reed. He stood as a symbol of justice in a world collapsing into chaos. Yet his own story was one of quiet endurance, far from the noise of fame. Robert DoQui, born April 20th, 1934 in Stillwater, Oklahoma, was 53 when he appeared in RoboCop as Sergeant Warren Reed, the commanding officer who tried to hold together a broken police force. On screen, he was firm, composed, and unwavering, a man who believed in structure, even when everything around him was falling apart. Audiences trusted him instinctively. But long before Hollywood, DoQui's life began with music, not acting. Raised in Oklahoma, he earned a scholarship to Langston University, studying vocal performance, a path that hinted at a very different future. Acting came later, built through persistence rather than sudden recognition. Over time, he became a familiar presence, appearing in more than 130 film and television roles, including all 3 RoboCop films, rarely the lead, but always essential. Behind the scenes, few realized how disciplined his career truly was. No scandals, no dramatic headlines, just decades of steady work in an industry defined by unpredictability. And yet, what happens to those who give everything to their craft but remain quietly in the background? In 2008, at the age of 73, DoQui passed away from natural causes, closing a life that never demanded attention but earned respect. By 2026, his legacy lives on not through fame, but through consistency, proof that sometimes the strongest presence is the one that never needed the spotlight. Jesse D. Goins as Joe Cox. He appeared briefly in a world of violence and chaos. Yet his own story would quietly fade into something far more elusive. Jesse D. Goins, born around July 23, 1952 in New York, was in his mid-30s when he took on the role of Joe Cox in RoboCop, one of the many faces within Clarence Boddicker's dangerous circle. On screen, he was part of the tension, a presence that added to the brutality surrounding Murphy's fall. Not the loudest, not the most remembered, but still essential to the world that made the story feel real. Before acting, Goins followed a path shaped by education and discipline, studying theater at institutions like the University of Michigan and SUNY Brockport. His career unfolded steadily with appearances in television and film, including The Greatest American Hero Patriot Games and later The Ugly Truth. There were no headlines, no scandals, only consistent work in an unpredictable industry. And then something unusual happened. He stepped away. Details of his later life remain scarce, almost intentionally so. By 2026, in his early 70s, his presence is remembered mostly through reunions and the echoes of past roles. Sometimes the most intriguing story is the one that chooses to remain untold. Zamora as Kaplan. He played a man lost in chaos. But long before that, he had already lived a life most actors would never dare imagine. Zamora, born in Roswell, New Mexico, brought Kaplan to life in RoboCop, a quiet but dangerous member of Boddicker's gang, blending into the violence without ever demanding attention. His presence was subtle, almost ghost-like, yet it made the world feel more real, more unpredictable. But behind that brief role was a journey defined by survival. Of Apache Mescalero and Mexican heritage, Zamora pursued method acting with a level of commitment that blurred the line between performance and reality. For 3 years, he lived out of a van with his dog chasing auditions across cities, enduring uncertainty with no guarantee of success. It wasn't preparation, it was existence. How many would keep going under those conditions? After RoboCop, his path shifted quietly. He appeared in films like Repo Man and Born in East LA, but gradually moved behind the camera, becoming a writer and director shaping stories instead of standing inside them. Unlike many, he didn't chase visibility, he chose control. By 2026, much of his life remains out of public view, his work continuing behind the scenes. And perhaps that is his truest identity, not the man on screen, but the one who endured long enough to tell stories worth remembering. Felton Perry as Donald Johnson. He once left everything behind before anyone even knew his name. And somehow that decision became the foundation of everything that followed. Felton Perry, born September 11, 1945 in Chicago, Illinois, was 42 when he appeared in RoboCop as Donald Johnson, a composed and observant OCP employee, navigating a world driven by corporate ambition. His role was subtle, almost understated, yet it added a quiet realism to the machinery of power that defined the film. Long before Hollywood, Perry's life had already taken a dramatic turn. At just 16, he dropped out of high school and enlisted in the United States Marine Corps, serving 4 years before returning to rebuild what he had left behind. Education became his second beginning, studying at Roosevelt University and later the University of Chicago, where his path toward acting slowly emerged. It wasn't a straight road, it was a reconstruction. After RoboCop, Perry built a steady career through films like Magnum Force and Walking Tall, eventually appearing across all 3 RoboCop installments. Beyond acting, he turned to writing, creating stage work such as By the By and By, shaping stories from a life already filled with transformation. By 2026 at 80, he lives quietly after retiring from acting in 2007. And in the end, his story remains one of reinvention, proof that sometimes walking away is where everything truly begins. For the cast of RoboCop 1987, the story didn't end when the cameras stopped. It fractured into something far more human. Some are gone like Miguel Ferrer, taken quietly by illness. Others endured carrying loss, reinvention, or lives that drifted far from the spotlight. Behind the armor, behind the violence, were people navigating grief, love, and the cost of being remembered for one role. Because maybe that was always the truth. RoboCop was never just about losing humanity to machines, it was about how fragile that humanity really is. And the irony. The film warned us about becoming less human, while the people inside it were fighting to stay exactly that. So tell me whose story stayed with you the most, and who do you think paid the highest price for fame? Because if RoboCop was about a man losing his identity, how many of them never truly got theirs back?